All right, in this nugget, we're going to be talking about configuring server core. This is really a very simple nugget, and I just have one whiteboard, so I don't have an introductory whiteboard other than what we see right here. We'll just get right into configuring server core. All right, let's take a look here at configuring server core. Now, I mentioned in a previous nugget that I don't extrapolate too terribly much on core by itself, only because a lot of what we do there is really just PowerShell, and anything that I show you on a full edition of 2012 will also apply to the core edition of 2012, unless that commandlet has something to do with the full GUI. So otherwise, it'll all still apply either way, and many of the commands may be available for you up there on that PowerShell cheat sheet that I mentioned previously. Also, some of the other commands you can use and some of the other aliases. Let's take a look at that. What's, first of all, an alias? Well, this is what gives us basically the functionality of a command prompt. So if we're at a PowerShell prompt, let's say if I go down here to the quick launch area and I just launch Windows PowerShell, then I can type, of course, PowerShell commandlets in here. But also, notice that I can do things such as simple command prompt items that I would have normally had from a cmd.exe. What's an example? How about dir? Okay, that's just a directory listing, right? Well, that's not a PowerShell commandlet. It's an alias, though, that kind of points back to the command prompt functionality and still gives me a good result with that. So most of the things you can do in a command prompt, you can still do in a PowerShell console through aliases. And you don't need to know anything else special or elaborate to be able to use them. It's just that it does that for you. Anything you already know about command prompt commands, you can still do in a PowerShell window. Also, there's other commands, and this is just a couple of examples. For example, the DISM, the Deployment Image Servicing and Management item that you can use. I'll give you some examples of that in the PowerShell cheat sheet as well. Even though it's not a PowerShell commandlet, you can still use that from within a PowerShell command prompt window. Then, of course, the other thing you could do would be to use simple remote administration. You can do that through a console, for example. Or some certain PowerShell commands will allow you to enter in the computer name flag, like that. Okay, and then you would just enter in whatever the name of the computer is in here. And then you can also use something like sconfig, which I really like. It actually debuted with Server 2008 R2, and it's a great way to configure core machines. Let's go ahead and take a look here, first of all, though, at a little bit of background on how I'm going to show this to you. This is a physical computer that we're looking at, and this is my Hyper-V host computer. You can see here that I've got a couple of Hyper-V, or actually a few Hyper-V items running inside of this. One of them is DC Nugget 1, which I'm going to make a domain controller in an upcoming nugget here. And then I'm also going to work here in this case with VMC Nugget 02. This is a baseline configuration of server core, and I have really no configuration at all going on with this so far. So it's kind of pretty much right out of the box, and I'm just going to minimize that background window so as to be a little less distracting. Now, how would I go ahead and configure this? Well, there are a few ways of doing this, and I want to point out, first of all, that I do have a document available for you here. And it's called Server Core Configuration, and it's a PDF for you available up on NuggetLab.com. There's a lot of guidance here in the beginning, which I won't elaborate on right now, but you can take a look at that. And then here I'm just going to show you some things such as how to configure some of the basic properties, and you can do this using NetShell. Now, of course, there might be other tools you can use as well. Nevertheless, even on a core installation that has PowerShell, NetShell seems to still be the preferred method here. So how would I do this if I wanted to configure a static IP address? Well, the first thing I need to know is to know what the interfaces are. So I do a NetShell interface IPv4, which is still the predominant version of IP that we're using here, and then show interfaces. Okay, interfaces. And then what that tells me is really the key here being the index. So I can use the index, or for certain other things I can use something called just whatever the name is. Notice that it used to say local area network used to be the name. Now Microsoft has gratefully shortened that to just Ethernet in this case. So what I would do here next is if I wanted to set a static IP address for this machine, is I would just enter that in this one. Or actually, first let me show you my IP configuration. I'll do an IP config all, and you can see that as I go back up here to my Ethernet adapter, that it does have a current IP address, but it's just issued by a DHCP server here, and I don't really have a DNS server other than this one configured right here. But if I wanted to set any of that up statically, I would have to do something different here. Now, we already learned from our previous command here that we are on index 12 and it's the Ethernet is the name. So knowing that, I can enter in a net shell command to set up a static IP address like this. And I just went ahead and paused recording and typed all that in, as you can see. But I would just use net shell, and then interface is going to be going to IP version 4. That's what I'm trying to configure. I'm going to set the address, and then the name equals Ethernet, which you can see up here is Ethernet. You can also use index equals and do an index equals 12, but I just did name Ethernet. Source equals static address, and it wraps around, so you just kind of have to look at the word as it wraps around here. And then address, this is the static IP address I want, 10.10.10.82, and a subnet mask of a class C subnet mask. Then I want a gateway address of 10.10.10.1. Notice that in this configuration, there's no DNS configuration. You do that later. Okay, so I'll go ahead and press enter. Now I'll do an ipconfig all, and we can now see that we have 10.10.10.82 and with the class C subnet mask and so on. We can also do, again, the DNS server if I needed to, which I'll do shortly. Oh, I almost forgot. Here's the default gateway, which I also specified in that previous command. Then in order to configure the DNS server's IP address on this local client, I would enter in net shell, and then you could type interface, but you can also abbreviate that one. Int is sufficient. And I'm gotten too lazy to put all the typing, so I abbreviated. Then IP version 4, add DNS server, name equals, again, Ethernet. And then this time, address is going to be the IP address of my DNS server. And index equals 1 simply identifies that I want to make it the primary DNS server. This is not index as in what we took a look at earlier when we saw that the local adapter was index 12. That's not relating to the same thing. This simply specifies that I want that to be my primary server. Okay, then we press enter. And then now if I do an IP config all, we see that we do indeed have the DNS server at 10.10.10.70. So using net shell, you can configure your IP properties as necessary. And we also want to do some other things, such as changing the computer name, because Windows, by default, will just install the computer with a strange, convoluted name. You'll see what I mean in a moment. First thing we want to do is to identify what the existing name of the computer is, and we can't really right-click on my computer and choose properties to find that out, because obviously there's nothing to right-click on. So we could do it a few other ways. An ipconfig all will show that to us. If we just go up here, we'll see that there's the name of the computer there. There's the host name. But there's also a lot of other data we don't really need to see. We can also use set, which shows us a lot of environment variables for this system, plus the computer name right here again. Okay. Or we could just do host name, which gives you just the host name. That's probably the plainest of all of those. But you can see how Microsoft just kind of names it some convoluted name there. I don't know why they do that, but I guess they have to do something. So let's go ahead and clear the screen here and figure out how we would rename the computer, in this case by using the netdom command. So in order to rename the computer, here's how I would use that. Netdom, then rename computer. You can do other things with netdom as well, such as joining a domain. But rename computer, and then percent computer name percent. Now, why am I doing that? Because I already forgot the name of this computer. It was so convoluted, I didn't want to have to think of it. I actually waste brain cells thinking about it anyway, because I'm renaming the computer anyhow, and it wouldn't matter. So I'm just doing a variable of percent computer name percent, which means that whatever the name of the computer is, we're going to rename it to a new name here, VMCNugget02 /user D, and then this would be the name of the user credentials that we're implementing here. And then we can also do a password, then a colon, and then the password if we wanted to. However, I'm not going to do that in this case because if you do that, you have to type it in plain text. If we leave off the actual password, then it prompts us for it. And then it's a reboot :0, meaning reboot in 0 seconds, so that it will accept that new computer name, because as you know, anytime you rename a computer, you do have to restart it in order for that to take. So that having been done, I'm going to go ahead and press enter here. Oops, except I see I made a mistake. Let's go back over here. There's no space after user D. Okay, so I'll press enter here, and then it says, do you want to proceed? It's just telling me that some services, such as a CA, or certification authority, will depend upon a fixed machine name. So if this was a CA, that would really cause a problem with that. It's not. So I'm just going to press Y and enter, and now we can see that it is going ahead and restart. All right, and then once we've renamed the computer and it's restarted here, we can use netdom to join the computer Again, you can specify the computer name or enter in the variable like you see here. And then /domain, the name of the domain. You can also just put in Nugget Lab here, or the flat name of the domain, as opposed to the fully qualified domain name, as in .com here. And then /userd, and then administrator in my case, but whoever has the privileges to be able to join this computer to the domain, and then /password, and then if you don't enter in a password there, it will prompt you as well. Then the reboot. This is actually the number of seconds, by the way, for the reboot, so you can give it a few seconds, or if you just entered a 0 there, then it would reboot immediately. Now, I don't actually have this domain up and running yet, so it's not going to give me anything if I press enter, and I think it'll just bark at me. Yeah, it says the domain doesn't actually exist, as I mentioned. But if you do have one, then of course it will then join it at that point. The next thing I might want to do would be to create a user account, because by default I've only got the local administrator account. I usually use the trainer account for all my demonstrations, so I might want to add that account and log on with it. And of course you'll want to add yours as well for your own purposes. So I would just do a net user, and then the name of the user, trainer in this case, and /add. Oh, also there's another thing you can do here. If I just put it in asterisk, it'll prompt me for the password. Otherwise it will not assign a password, and I'll just have to change it at the first logon. Okay, so I'll enter in a password and confirm that. You can't really see what I'm typing, of course, because it doesn't show on the screen, but I entered and confirmed that password. And then the next thing I probably need to do is to add it to the local administrators group in this case, or of course, you would add your account to whichever group was interesting to you. But I would do a net local group, and then the name of the group I'm interested in adding it to, and that would be administrators. I think I typed that right. Okay, and then the name of the, then I want to add, is what I want to do here. So I want to add it to, and then I'm going to enter in the name of the account, okay, of being trainer. Okay. Now if I do a net user trainer without any other options here, except for typing correctly, then we'll see that I'm able to confirm that I have indeed added it to the local administrators security group, as well as it's already by default anyway a member of users. But we see that we're successful in creating this account now. Now the next thing I want to show you here is sconfig, and this is something I really, really like for configuring these servers. Let me go back and close the console there, and then let me go back to this VMC Nugget 2, and I'm going to go back to the baseline, which has no configuration to it. Okay, so I'm going to right-click on this and choose Apply. Now what am I doing when I do this by clicking Apply here? What happens is it started off this way, and then time went by, and I was configuring this, and I was configuring that, and I changed the IP address, and I changed the computer name, and so on. Well, I can go back to a previous point in time. That's my baseline here. I recommend that you create a baseline of your virtual machines so that if you need to get back to a known good situation with that machine, then you can do so. This has no configuration of any kind on it, and now I'm going to go ahead and just actually start this virtual machine. Okay, so I'll go over here and click Start, and then I'll go ahead and open it up. Now the next thing I want to show you, though, while this is happening, is I want to talk to you about how we can use sconfig to more easily configure your servers. This is just a message saying that although I clicked in the window, the mouse driver hadn't loaded yet, and so it didn't really do anything for me at that point. Alright, so now I've rebooted this computer, and if I do a few things here like a host name, you'll see that it's back to whatever the default name was that it came up with when it renamed this during installation. And then I'll do an IP config. You see I've got just my old DHCP assigned IP address there. So there's nothing configured on this machine. But one of the coolest tools you can use besides NetShell and NetDOM and others would be to use sconfig. This actually came out with Server 2008 R2, and it does a lot of the same things. It's just that it does it through a menu system, which is much easier to work with. For example, the computer name item here. Let's start with that one, number 2. So press the number 2 and press Enter, and then it asks me for the new computer name, which I want to be VMC Nugget 02, and press Enter. It says you must restart. Do you want to do this now? No, I don't want to do that now. How about joining it to a domain or work group? I'll enter in 1 to join it to a domain. I'll press D for domain, the name of the domain. It may bark at me because I don't actually have that domain yet, but I would specify the name of the domain and the user and the password if it's associated, something like this. And then, as I said, it doesn't actually have that domain up and running yet. We're going to do that in an upcoming nugget. Then what we would do here is we can also configure remote management. Now, I actually did do that configuration so that I could show some things remotely just in case I wanted to. But if I didn't, I could choose number 4 and then choose to enable, disable, or configure the server response to ping. Now, this is something that's actually pretty interesting. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let me open up a command prompt in another machine here. I'm going to drag the command prompt over here. This is actually a command prompt from my Windows 7 computer. But if I try to ping 10.10.10.40 right now, I'm not going to get anything. Now, we know that the IP address of this machine over here is .40 because we saw that earlier. So why am I not getting a ping response back? If you're not familiar with ping, it's a good way to test network connectivity to a destination. This would fool me into thinking, just by looking at this would fool me into thinking, oh no, that machine's down because I'm not getting any answers back. But what we can do is to enable it to respond to ping, because right now the firewall actually prevents that. So I can configure response to ping, allow machines to ping this server, yes. Now when I go back up here, I can run this again, and now we can see that we can get replies back to it. So it's a great way to test it. Not a lot of security vulnerability in allowing ping, unless you are concerned about getting a flurry of pings and some kind of a denial of service attack, but there's a lot of things in place nowadays, both in networking equipment as well as the operating system, that can detect that kind of an attack and stop it short. Okay, let's see what else we got. I'm going to return to the main menu by pressing number 4, and I think you can probably figure out how to use this whole interface, so I'm not going to elaborate an awful lot on it, other than to also point to let's see, network settings, number 8, and you can see here that my IP address is now 10.10.10.40, and I can select the network adapter, which would be number 10, to change that. Okay, you can see there was 10, so that's what I entered in here. And then what I would want to do now is to set the network adapter address. And I can set it up as a static address and 10.10.10. Oh, I don't even remember what I gave this one, 82 maybe, something like that. And then my subnet mask, Class C subnet mask. We'll talk more about IP addresses and subnet masks and default gateways and things like that at a later point in time. But just in brief, this is how I'm identified on the network by IP address. This is something that will help to identify which network segment I'm on. This will configure where network traffic goes when I'm trying to find a host that's not on my own same network. And then that's pretty much it for that part. The next thing I could do then is to set the DNS server. Of course, we want to do that as well. So I'll enter in the new preferred DNS server, and that'll just be an IP address, 10.10.10. I think I have one at 70. So then it says me my preferred DNS server is set. And if I have an alternate, I can do that as well. Okay, so I'll enter in the alternate DNS server. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now what I could do is just return to the main menu, and I could actually then exit this as well. So I'll exit to a command line, and then I'll do an ipconfig all, and we'll see that we were able to successfully configure all of those things: the DNS, the subnet mask, the IP address, the default gateway, all those things. The name of the host is not changed yet because I haven't rebooted it, but otherwise using sconfig is a great way to go. Very intuitive. You don't have to worry about typos for the most part, and I strongly recommend it for new configurations of your core machine. Now, I talked to you in previous times here about remotely connecting to a core machine using the MMC console. This can be done through remote server administration tools in Windows 8, or in Windows Server 2012 from a full GUI machine. But I need to open up the firewall in order to allow that to happen. Otherwise, the firewall that's turned on by default will block the request to remotely administer. So here's what I would do. I would do a netshell adv firewall, set rule group equals, and then quotations, remote administration, quotes because of the space there, and then new enable equals yes. Okay, so that's how I would enable that. Now, I'm not going to actually turn that one on quite yet, but I do want to show you another thing you might want to do in some instances. This would be the case if, number one, you have a third-party firewall, software firewall, that you're using instead of Microsoft's own firewall. Normally, when you install those, it will disable the Microsoft firewall, and it will enable its own firewall. But if for some reason the Microsoft firewall has gotten turned back on again, then it could cause a conflict and some problems by having two firewalls on simultaneously. So you might want to disable the firewall, the Windows firewall, for that reason. The other one would be maybe you're in an initial configuration state, kind of like how we are right here, and we need to do a lot of things that use kind of weird ports over the network or something like that, maybe to install some network applications, stuff like that. Well, if that's the case, you might want to just disable the firewall entirely, only temporarily and only if you're in a secure environment. Maybe I have a hardware firewall that already serves that purpose for me for the firewall. So in those types of situations, you could do a net shell and then an ADV firewall. Okay, and then set all profiles, state, and then off. And then we would have disabled the firewall. Now let me show you how I could take advantage of that now by remote administration. So for example, here I'm remotely connected to or actually I'm locally connected to computer management. But I want to be remotely connected by connecting to another computer with a right click here. And then I would just enter in the IP address of that host, 10.10.10.82, and now you can see I'm remotely connected to all of those tools and then could do whatever I needed to, whether it's to adjust disk space or look at event logs or something like that. And then one other thing you could do here is if you want to reset everything back to the initial configuration. It's kind of tough to follow what's going on in the firewall if you're working strictly from a command prompt here. So if you need to reset everything, you can do a net shell ADV firewall. I must be getting late, and my typing skills are going all down south here. Okay, so net shell advanced firewall reset, and then we're okay again. So that should take us back to the out-of-the-box firewall settings. In this nugget, we talked about configuring server core. This is a very important nugget because a lot of your servers right now are going to be server core machines, so you need to know how to administer them and how to remotely administer them. We showed you how to configure them locally using a command prompt or sconfig, and we also took a look at other things, such as opening up the firewall so that you could use remote consoles. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.